So I now invite Dr. Atul Patel to speak about 10 common mistakes in clinical mycology.
So good morning, and we know that like mistakes are the best thing to learn, right? So we learn so many things from our mistakes that we made in clinical practice. So I'm going to talk to you about the 10 common mistakes that we do in clinical mycology. Some of the mistakes that I did in my clinical practice and some of the mistakes that I observed from my colleague who are making a mistakes, and I have compiled all these mistakes to discuss with you. The first and very important mistakes that I found, which is very important, is that because we do not suspect that fungi could be responsible for these clinical presentations, we have not requested whenever we are doing the biopsy or collecting the biological sample from the patients. We fail to request the direct microscopic examination with either the wet film examination with KOH or if facility is available, Calcofluor white. And these mistakes, let me tell you that it's very common. And the most important reason is that fungal infection is not on our board for differential diagnosis. And many times, like the consultant are so confident that we have sent culture and we have sent histopathology, so we are not bothered about the direct microscopic examination. We are going to get results from culture and histopath. So that probably overconfidence is also partially responsible for not sending, not looking for the KOH examination or the direct microscopic examination. But let me tell you that it has immense value. And the most important part is that the turnaround time of direct microscopic examination is just 30 minutes to 1 hour. So once your sample reaches to the laboratory, within 30 minutes to hour, the microbiologist can give you a confirmed diagnosis about your patient's clinical conditions. So it is of immense value. Let me give you an example. This young lady had the florid chicken pox, and she has received steroids and IVGG for that chicken pox. Why she was being treated with IVGG and steroid, we don't know. But when she came to our hospital in altered sensorium with high grade fever and localizing signs on the right side, so we did MRI brain, and what we found that patient was having a mass lesion with midline shift and requires urgent decompressive craniotomy just to control the raised intracranial pressure. And at the same time, we took a biopsy from that enhancing lesions into the frontotemporal region. And the direct microscopic examination, so within the 30 minutes of decompressive craniotomy surgery, we got a report from a microbiology lab that there is a presence of septate fungal mycelia, right? So you can see that here, the direct microscopic examination of the brain showing this septate fungus. So from this, we are sure that we are not dealing with mucormycosis because this is a septate and the acute angle branching. So we can select appropriate antifungal drug at the same time, right? So we are sure that this is a mycelial infections and it is not morphologically looking like a mucormycosis. And so we can give appropriate antifungal therapy within an hour of undergoing procedures. So direct microscopic examination has immense value. So never ever forgot to send a request to a microbiology lab for direct microscopic examination. Again, the second mistake is in the same line of fail to send a direct microscopic examination. Many times when we took a biopsy, we send a sample for culture and histopathology. And we forgot to mention that fungal infection is still on the board, and we need to request that we also require a fungal culture. So let me give you another examples, and this mistake was done by me. This gentleman has a prolonged fever, undiagnosed fever, with constitutional symptoms, weight loss, and the adrenal enlargement with lymphadenopathy. And in my country, in India, like tuberculosis is always there when somebody is having a constitutional symptoms, fever, lymphadenopathy, and adrenal enlargement. And look at this, the CT scan of abdomen. There is a bulky adrenal with foci of necrosis within the adrenal gland, right? So it's very likely that, I was confident that it's very likely that I'm dealing with tuberculosis in this gentleman. So we performed a biopsy and sent for gene expert TB culture and the histopathology examination. But fortunately, the histopathologist was brilliant, and she could pick up that this adrenal biopsy is filled up with the histoplasma, and we could come to a diagnosis of histoplasma just because of the histopathological examination. So I think that in this situation, if I have added the culture, fungal culture, and we know that histoplasma takes a longer time to grow, right? So patients, we need to incubate it for more than 2 to 3 weeks time to get a culture positive for histoplasma. So we need to keep a differential diagnosis of fungi, and we should also request appropriate fungal culture in a biopsy samples, right? So this is a second common mistakes that I discuss. The third mistake is that many times, like, the patient is receiving so many drugs, and we found that patient is also having some invasive fungal infections, and we have put one more drugs, that is antifungal agents, to treat that invasive fungal infections. But we forgot that patient is receiving concomitantly many other medications. And yesterday I talked to you about the drug-drug interactions, because all the azoles, they have a potency to inhibit CYP3A4. The fluconazole is also inhibiting CYP3A4, itraconazole, voriconazole, and including posaconazole, right? So because of this, their property of inhibiting CYP3A4, plus they also inhibit the P-glycoprotein. So both these, the actions of antifungal agents on this enzyme system leads to the elevations of the other concomitantly used drugs which utilizes the same pathways, right? So if my drugs, say for example amiodarone or the benzodiazepines, they utilize the CYP3A4 system for their metabolism. So if I am using fluconazole or itraconazole or voriconazole, then I'm inhibiting P-glycoprotein as well as I'm inhibiting CYP3A4 system, and which leads to the exponential increase in the level of the drug which is being metabolized by the same pathway like amiodarone or the benzodiazepines, right? And including warfarin. So this can lead to a life-threatening significant drug-drug interactions. So your patients can have life-threatening QT prolongations because of the concomitant use of antifungal. And we know that azoles have also tendency to increase the QT prolongation, right? So both these drugs leads to the life-threatening fatal arrhythmias, and you may lose your patient. At the same time, when patient is receiving some other drugs, because azoles are also metabolized by the same liver enzyme system, and if you are using drugs like rifampicin or some anti-epileptic drugs like carbamazepine or the phenytoin, so all these drugs can lead to the hepatic microsomal enzyme induction. So if you are using rifampicin or some the anti-epileptic drugs along with your azole drugs, then what will happen? It will induce the enzymes, and it will lead to the subtherapeutic or the suboptimum levels of your antifungal agents, and this will result into a treatment failure. So even though you have made a correct diagnosis, even though you have selected a correct antifungal therapy, but because of these drug-drug interactions, you are not going to get the optimum results out of your diagnosis and the prescribing antifungal therapy. So we need to, look into all these drug-drug interactions, bilateral drug interactions, like azole is acting on some other drugs, and the other drugs also acting on the azoles. And this is the fourth common mistakes. Because in ICU, patient is very sick and patient is receiving the other nephrotoxic agents like aminoglycosides or colistin when somebody is having drug resistance gram-negative infections. And if you have diagnosed some invasive fungal infection requiring amphotericin therapy, that means you have put 2 nephrotoxic drugs on the board. and this can lead to the aggravations of the nephrotoxicity of each compounds, right? So you should be very careful whenever you prescribe antifungal therapy like azole or amphotericin. Always look into the patient's prescriptions completely, thoroughly, look for the drug-drug interactions and look for the concomitant use of any other nephrotoxic agents, right? So this can reduces the nephrotoxicities that we expect from the amphotericin use in clinical practice. The, the fifth mistake, I think, which is very common and I have observed from the colleagues, and what will happen, like you made a diagnosis that patient is having fungal infections and you have prescribed fluconazole for treatment of that fungal infection. But because patient is in ICU, patient is having unstable hemodynamics parameters and the renal parameters. So say for example, when you make a diagnosis of invasive fungal infection in ICU admitted patient with serum creatinine of 2, and if you have calculated the eGFR, and if it is around, say for example, 48 or something like this, 48 ml per minute. So here you have adjusted a dose of fluconazole. You have reduces the dose of fluconazole to half according to the patient's calculated eGFR. But now what will happen? Day 3 of ICU, there is further worsening in the hemodynamics parameter, there is further worsening into the creatinine. And at one time point, like the nephrologist may plan a hemodialysis. Now you have adjusted the dose of your antifungal therapy on day 1 based on the day 1 creatinine clearance, but on day 3 onwards, the patient may require hemodialysis, and here we again need to intervene according to the renal replacement therapy, and we need to adjust the dose of fluconazole. Let me explain you in detail. So the recommendation of fluconazole in renal replacement therapy says that if your patient is receiving hemodialysis, so you have to give a full dose of fluconazole that you have calculated like 6 milligram per kg or whatever on the day of hemodialysis after dialysis, right? So if patient requires 400 milligram of fluconazole with a normal renal functions, the same dose to be given on the day of dialysis after completion of dialysis, right? So rather than giving a 50% dose, you have to give a complete dose or the calculated dose of fluconazole. But next day what will happen? Like the nephrologist has planned thrice a week hemodialysis. So next day patient is not undergoing hemodialysis. So here again, if you look at the creatinine clearance, now it is less than 10. You have to consider it is less than 10, even though your creatinine and everything is good after dialysis, right? But that doesn't mean that patient's kidney has improved. So when you have put your patients on hemodialysis, even though it is thrice a week, you need to reduce the dose in the day where the hemodialysis is not offered. So 400 milligram that you have given after dialysis, now you have to reduce it to the 50%, right? So this is how you have to adjust. And suppose if your patient is undergoing CRRT or the continuous renal replacement therapy with CVVHD, then what will happen? Here, the glomerular filtration is augmented, it is increased. So here you need to give very high dose of fluconazole, right? So it could be a 10 to 12 milligram per kg per day, or 1200 to 1600 milligram of fluconazole per day in case where patient is receiving continuous venovenous ultrafiltrations, right? So this is very important that according to the renal functions, you need to look into your antifungal dosage daily, and you have to adjust your antifungal administrations according to the renal replacement therapy. So this is very important for clinicians to understand. This is what I discussed in the drug-drug interactions, that QT prolongation is the most common side effects of azole therapy. So we need to monitor the QT interval when patient is receiving some other drugs like quinolones or the amiodarone. All these drugs tends to increase, including clarithromycin, erythromycin. So these are the drugs where we expect cardiac toxicity in form of prolongations of QT. So when you prescribe azole plus quinolones like either ciprofloxacin, moxifloxacin or levofloxacin, or erythromycin or clarithromycin, then we need to be very careful, because there is additional QT prolongations and you will end up with some life-threatening arrhythmias. TDM, like TDM is, I think it is extremely important. whenever you are treating a patient who has a life-threatening invasive fungal infection, you cannot ignore the value of TDM. The reason is that many times the clinicians feel that I'm prescribing antifungal according to the prescribed milligram per kilogram per day dosage. So then why should I go for a TDM? Why should I waste money? Why should I invest money in getting a TDM? But we know that the fluconazole has, it is a water soluble drug and it has got a linear pharmacokinetic parameters. So fluconazole do not require TDM, but if your patient is on itraconazole or posaconazole or voriconazole, these are the drug where you have to have a therapeutic drug monitoring done, especially for voriconazole when you are treating invasive pulmonary aspergillosis or aspergillus brain infections or so on. The reason is that the voriconazole in adult has non-linear pharmacokinetics, and there is very high patient to patients and interpatients and in the same patients variability of voriconazole. There are several other factors which also affects the absorptions of voriconazole, like food and the other antacids and H2 blockers and other. So you need to get a therapeutic drug monitoring of all these antifungals whenever you are using this drug for treatment of severe life-threatening invasive fungal infections. And you cannot underestimate the value of these drugs. And you know that like the metabolisms of voriconazole is dependent, is mainly by the CYP2C19. And there is a significant genetic variations amongst the Asians. And many Asians, they are slow metabolizers. So what will happen if you are giving them a standard calculated dose according to the milligram per kg? Then they can have very high drug level, and voriconazole has a good correlation with voriconazole toxicities and the very high trough levels, right? And at the same time, like we have so many documents which says that if you have maintained voriconazole levels into the therapeutic drug range, then there is a successful outcomes in fungal infection. So TDM has immense value in clinical management. So always try to get therapeutic drug monitoring of itraconazole, voriconazole, and posaconazole. This is a mistake that we see in my country, in India, where because I mean the clinicians, they are afraid of using amphotericin B because of the nephrotoxicity, and liposomal has very high cost. Though syrup posaconazole is not that cheap, the 5 days cost of posaconazole syrup will cost around 16,000 Indian currency to a patient, so it is also equally expensive. But being orally administered and with less side effects compared to intravenous amphotericin and very easily tolerable. So many times, like clinicians, they are tempted to start posaconazole for treatment of mucormycosis when somebody is having a mucor infection. Here, like, I mean, this mistake, one should be very clear and he should avoid using posaconazole as a first line therapy for treatment of mucormycosis. The reason is that the suspension posaconazole takes almost 7 days to achieve a steady state level. That means that even if you have started posaconazole from today, you are not going to have any antifungal activity for first 1 week of starting posaconazole. And yesterday I told you that mucor is having a angio-invasive property, right? So once the mucor start invading the blood vessels nearby, you can have devastating outcome with metastatic lesions, rapid spread to the other organs, and you may lose your patient, right? So you have to start with amphotericin rather than looking at posaconazole as a start of beginning of therapy. This is again very commonly seen in, especially in ICU admitted patients, where the patient is receiving multiple antibiotics and catheterized, and the candida has been reported from the urine. And yesterday we had a nice talk on how to interpret candida into the urine. But what will happen, like the patient has received already fluconazole, and because of the under influence of the previous treatment with fluconazole, the Candida urinary isolate has now emerged as a non-albicans, and because of this reports from a laboratory with non-albicans Candida which has been grown from the urine sample, the clinicians, they try to use, because fluconazole here is obviously resistant for a non-albicans, they try to use echinocandins or the voriconazole for the treatment of this Candida non-albicans urinary tract infection. Here, yesterday it was very clearly says that most of the time, like once you remove the catheter, the large number of patients you will get out of this Candida urinary infections. And if it is not possible to remove catheter, you can just replace it, and almost 20% of the patients can have resolution of the Candida into the urinary system. Right? So, but here like what the clinician will do, they will try to target this non-albicans Candida with either echinocandins or voriconazole, considering that these drugs are susceptible for this non-albicans Candida. The issue here is that if you look into the pharmacology of these two drugs, both these drugs are not going to achieve the adequate concentrations to inhibit the Candida into the free urine. Right? So this drug is not going to excreted by the kidney into the urinary system to achieve sufficient concentrations to inhibit these organisms. So these drugs are useless. Even if you have a confirmed symptomatic Candida urinary tract infection with non-albicans one, then you can't use these two drugs to treat this because there is no penetrations, right? So we have to avoid such mistakes in clinical practice. And the last mistake is again discussed well yesterday. That's the Candida have been isolated from the sputum or the BAL sample, and clinicians are tempted to treat this, and we should avoid using antifungal agents to a report which is generated from the microbiology lab that your sputum or the BAL sample is growing Candida. So we know that it is colonizers like, right? So there is no need to worry and no need to, start antifungal therapy for such patients, right? Thank you very much for the patience listening.